The night the private messages surfaced, the city seemed to glow a little harsher than usual, as if every streetlight had sharpened its edges. Notifications moved through phones like ripples in dark water, and one name rose again and again in the glow of screens: Kim Taehyung. It wasn't a song release or a stage appearance this time. It was a fragment of something meant to stay quiet, lifted into the noise of the world. In a small apartment where the windows faced a tangle of wires and neon, a fan refreshed her feed with a feeling she couldn't name. Curiosity and worry braided together in her chest. The posts didn't feel like news, they felt like someone opening a door that had been closed for a reason. She wondered when it became normal for private words to be handled like public property. Across the city, Taehyung sat in a room that had learned the sound of silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, just careful. His phone lay face down on the table, the way people set down fragile things when they're afraid of breaking them. He knew the pattern of this moment. He had seen how quickly a story grows legs once it's let loose. The messages were old, pulled from a context that no longer existed. They had been written in a time shaped by different pressures, different conversations, different assumptions about who would ever read them. Now they were being read by millions who had no map of that moment, no sense of the room they were born in. Context had evaporated, and in its place stood speculation. Online, timelines stitched together narratives with the speed of practiced hands. Screenshots became evidence, guesses hardened into opinions, and opinions dressed themselves as certainty. Names of companies and executives drifted into the conversation, including HYBE, not as characters in a story but as symbols people could argue about without needing to know the whole truth. The legal world has its own language, one that sounds clean even when it handles mess. Words like submitted, relevant, and record create the illusion that everything is tidy once it enters a courtroom. But outside that room, feelings don't line up neatly. They spill. They stain. They linger in places no document can reach. Taehyung felt the familiar tug between wanting to speak and wanting to protect what little quiet remained. Silence could be mistaken for agreement. Speaking could be twisted into something else entirely. He knew this dance too well, the careful steps between saying enough and saying too much. Every move would be watched. When he finally addressed the situation, the tone was gentle but firm. The message carried a simple truth: private words were never meant to be weapons. They weren't endorsements. They weren't declarations of loyalty to any side of a complicated story. They were human, written in a human moment, never meant to travel this far from their origin. Some fans exhaled when they read his words. The relief wasn't about clearing a rumor, it was about hearing a voice that sounded like itself again. In the echo chamber of social media, sincerity is rare, and when it appears, it feels like finding a window in a crowded room. Not everyone accepted it, but many felt steadier for having heard it. Others argued anyway. The internet has never needed permission to keep talking. People debated what privacy should mean for public figures, whether fame dissolves the boundary between what is shared and what is owed. The arguments looped, familiar and unresolved, circling the same question without ever landing on an answer. In another part of the city, a journalist closed her laptop and stared at her reflection in the dark screen. She had written about idols for years, had learned the difference between reporting and feeding a storm. The lines blurred easily when clicks paid the rent. Tonight, she wondered which side of that line she was standing on. The controversy didn't exist in isolation. It was braided into a larger conflict that had already filled headlines, a legal battle whose details were complicated enough to turn truth into a maze. Names like Min Hee-jin were pulled into conversations that felt less about understanding and more about choosing sides. The story became a battlefield, and the messages were treated like flags. Taehyung watched as fragments of his life were arranged into shapes he didn't recognize. It was strange to see your own words move without you, like hearing your voice echo back from a canyon you didn't know you were standing near. He reminded himself that losing control of a narrative didn't mean losing himself. The two were not the same, even if they felt close. He went for a walk late, when the streets softened and the city learned how to whisper. The air carried the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. For a few minutes, he let himself be anonymous, another person passing under lights that didn't know his name. The world felt bigger when it wasn't staring back. Fans tried to do the small, invisible work of care. They reminded one another not to spread unverified claims, not to screenshot private moments, not to turn someone's personal words into ammunition. These reminders didn't trend. They rarely do. But they settled quietly into the corners of the fandom, building a gentler culture one message at a time. Managers spoke in careful sentences, shaped to protect more than they revealed. Legal teams moved in the background, their work silent but constant, like scaffolding holding up a structure no one notices until it's gone. The machinery of public life kept turning, even as people inside it tried to breathe. Time did what it always does. The storm shifted. New headlines pushed old ones down the feed. Attention wandered to fresher noise. But the residue of the moment lingered in small ways, in how Taehyung paused before sending messages now, in how fans learned to hesitate before sharing what felt intimate. There is a peculiar exhaustion that comes from being misread at scale. It isn't just the misunderstanding, it's the repetition of it, the way it echoes across platforms until it feels like the only sound left. Taehyung carried that exhaustion quietly, letting it shape his days without letting it define him. In interviews weeks later, his laughter returned easily, but his eyes held a little more caution. It wasn't bitterness. It was a boundary learned the hard way. He spoke about music, about craft, about finding stillness in a noisy world. He didn't know anyone the details of the storm he had walked through. Fans heard the subtext in his calm. They recognized the effort it takes to remain soft when the world sharpens around you. Some wrote letters they would never send, words of support that lived only in drafts and hearts. Support doesn't always need to be loud to be real. The legal controversy became a chapter in a much longer story about privacy in an age of capture. Screenshots don't carry tone. Court filings don't carry context. And public opinion, once formed, doesn't like to admit how little it knows. The lesson settled slowly, unevenly, across the spaces where people gathered to talk about it. One evening, Taehyung returned to the studio and let the quiet hum of equipment ground him. Music doesn't ask for explanations. It asks for presence. In the space between notes, he found the room to be human again, to be someone whose words could exist without being dissected. Outside, the city kept moving. Buses sighed at corners. Windows glowed with private lives continuing as if no headlines had ever been written. The world does this gentle thing after storms, it resumes. Not because nothing happened, but because living requires forward motion. The controversy would be remembered by some as drama, by others as a cautionary tale. For Taehyung, it became a reminder that boundaries are not walls, they are doors you choose when to open. Privacy is not secrecy, it is dignity. And dignity is a quiet thing, easy to overlook, hard to rebuild once it's been stepped on. In time, the noise softened into memory. The fragments found their place in the archive of moments that shaped him without owning him. He carried forward the parts that taught him care and left behind the parts that only taught him fear. Somewhere, a fan turned off her phone for the night and felt lighter for it. The world would keep talking. Screens would keep glowing. But in the spaces where phones rested face down on tables, there was room again for ordinary silence, the kind that lets people remember who they are when no one is watching. And in that quiet, the truth held steady, private messages belong to private lives. When they escape into the public square, the harm is rarely contained by explanations. What remains is the work of choosing empathy anyway, of letting people be human in a world that profits from forgetting they are.